If you fancy being sworn at and called a paedophile, there are a number of ways to do it. One way is to suggest that chavvy young woman at the checkout shouldn't be hitting her sprog with a leg of frozen lamb to stop it screaming the place down. Another is to suggest to an anti-cultural Marxist that gender is fluid, at which point it is worth considering the irony of anti-cultural Marxists making claims like "your gender is fixed by your chromosomes" or "transgenderism is impossible because you can't change sex." The usage of the word gender as a replacement for sex, according to my preferred etymological online dictionary, was in 1963. Larkin would surely raise a glass to this. And unsurprisingly, this usage was taken up by feminists eager to prove that just because there was no such thing as a builderess or a bus driveress, it didn't mean it was men's work. I highlight the use of the gendered noun because another odd claim made in regard to the word gender is there is no such thing as gender in the English language, by which people mean that English does not have D or la as a designation of whether a table is male or female. Apparently Old English does have this, but over time people have stopped worrying about the genitals of a fisherman's friend. And indeed feminists have obsessed for ages about the usage of S to denote a female performing an activity. Thus a female actor is no longer an actress, but an actor, which according to the theory makes for a gender-neutral descriptor rather than an admission that women can't act. And it might be argued that far from increasing the representation and status of female thespians, it just makes theatre reviews confusing, particularly when Juliet is played by someone called Leslie. Anywho, back to gender, sex, worshipping at the altar of feminism. Something that perhaps will not surprise you is that the new usage of gender as a replacement for the word sex comes from America, the land of white meat and dark meat, for fear of mentioning legs and breasts in front of elderly aunts and small children. It has all the American virtues of prudishness and enforced conformity, though I suppose it does allow for colleges to advertise gender studies courses and not scare the horses by promoting sex studies, which saves the little Julias of the Anti-Sex League from an attack of the vapours, as the last thing they wish to be reminded of is anything so messy as pleasure. And so it allows bookshops to have gender sections in addition to sex sections, thus escaping potential lawsuits from the type of people who spill coffee in their lap. Now they can safely buy a copy of the Kama Sutra and not mistakenly purchase the female eunuch, leading to 18 years in jail for attempted murder. But regardless, this issue was highlighted to me back in the 1990s by Professor Susan Greenfield, the eminent brain scientist, who pointed out the idiocy of using the word gender to describe biological sexual difference. Looking back, it would have been about the time that intersexual feminism was getting underway, so perhaps Professor Greenfield was feeling the first reverberations whispering through the world of academia. And being a scientist and knowing that words matter, she rightly pointed out that mislabelling things tends to lead to problems. And indeed I noticed that among the myriad of descriptions dreamed up by the gender studies classes as a way of allowing feminists to keep their place as the paragon of animals, one of the preferred gender pronouns is gender fluid. Which got me wondering if this is what has triggered the anti-cultural Marxist crowd into believing that those, like myself, who point out that gender is fluid, are covertly advocating that once you slip on a pair of your wife's knickers for a bit of heterosexual fun, that the next step is sex with your children, and beyond that, Morris dancing. Certainly the anti-cultural Marxists share a number of traits with their mortal enemies, the SJWs, the principal one being a humorlessness bordering on the irrational. And it's not easy to say humorlessness when you've had this much port. I realise that Freudian analysis is somewhat out of fashion these days, but it is worth considering that a shoe fetish for stiletto heels comes from a similar psychological place. And no, I'm not referring to Mary Mungo and Midge. Yet the same fetish in a woman makes her a high-maintenance girlfriend, and in a man it makes him a pervert. Aha! At this point will cry the scientifically minded among the anti-cultural Marxist crowd, and to a lesser extent among the exclusionary feminists, that it is natural selection in action. No woman would ever lower her standards to plumb the depths of depravity displayed by some bloke in high heels. Well, yes, perhaps, if you buy into the absurd notion that survival of the fittest means that the world is filled with lions. If a woman has a preference for a man in high heels, or tied to a bedpost, or jumping on her from the wardrobe dressed as an angel, then no amount of macho look at my muscles is going to lead to the transfer of genes to the next generation. Ah, yes, the scientifically minded will cry, that is an outlier, the exception that proves the rule. Some will go so far as to claim that this is fetishistic behaviour, it's an abnormality, ignoring that all sexual behaviour is fetishistic. Words matter, you see. Essentially, the argument on both sides, the feminist and the anti-cultural Marxist, being, I don't like your wife, so you can't sleep with her. It is surely no accident that TERFs are often loudest in their condemnation of this gender fluidity, while promoting the use of preferred gender pronouns, particularly in men. That doyenne of feminists, Germaine Greer, being a prime example. She is loud in her denunciations of transsexuals for not being women. It is odd, indeed, that many of the anti-cultural Marxist crowd often point to Miss Greer as if somehow she is proof of anything beyond her own barren hypocrisy. On the one hand, TERFs will point to assault, rape, the short skirt defence and 101 other cultural things as proof of the tyranny of being a woman, and that all these things define the experience, and being a man you wouldn't understand. Yet when you point out that on average transsexual women are more likely to suffer from all these onerous patriarchal oppressions, after much big sisterist hectoring, the conversation will invariably end up with the primary definition of the experience of the female gender being the ability to bleed at monthly intervals. Essentially, this is the mirror image of the anti-cultural Marxist blathering about chromosomes. What neither acknowledge is that all this upskirt voyeurism boils down to who gets a seat on the lifeboat and who can and can't be punched with honour. Or to put it another way, it is about gender being couched in the language of sex, since what all sides in this "if you bleed you're a woman" mob never mention is no one checks the women in the lifeboat to see if they've had a hysterectomy. And why would they? After all, it's nobody's business. There are millions of people living their lives happily shagging some woman who likes to be called Eric when on top, or weeing on each other, or doing all kinds of things that consenting adults get up to, who couldn't care less. But what they do know is that this replacement of the word sex with gender is total nonsense. and will remain so until such time as someone, anyone, mutters the immortal phrase, "Will you have gender with me?"